Hi, welcome to my apartment. I decided to do a lecture here today instead of going out for a walk, just to change things up, and also partly because I'm just a little sketched out about the outside world just today. So anyway, okay, so speaking of the external world, today's lecture topic is the external world skeptic. So this is part 2 of 4 of the lectures on Jim Pryor, the skeptic and the dogmatist. And the aim of today is to give the skeptic her due. So one of the things that I think is cool about this paper is that it exemplifies this thing that philosophers are trained to do, that we like to do, which is you take your opponent's view or your opponent's argument and you make it better, you make it stronger than they even were able to do it. And some people might wonder, why would you bother doing that? Why would you make your opponent's argument stronger than it has to be if you're trying to win the argument? But the point really in philosophy is not to win an argument, but to know the truth, or at least that's one way of thinking about what philosophy is for. So you don't want to just take on an opponent who has a worse argument than you could be giving them, because you want to get to the bottom of things. So if you're not giving them their best argument, I say this in my PH100 class sometimes, you might as well just stick your fingers in your ears and run away, because you're just avoiding the truth, or you're avoiding the potentially the truth. So what Pryor is interested in doing, in part, is to take the skeptic and give them a stronger, better view than they traditionally have. So of making things, just not me just sitting around lecturing, I thought I'd try to use some local props to explain what's going on in the argument for skepticism, and we just got this Candyland, so I'm going to set this up and talk about Candyland and skepticism. Okay, so here's a Candyland guy. He thinks he's in the licorice lagoon, but really he's being deceived. He's just a piece of plastic or whatever. His mind is being manipulated. He thinks he's really in the world, but he's not really in there. Okay, so one of the major things that goes on in The Skeptic and the Dogmatist is that Jim Pryor wants to shift the conversation away from knowledge and toward justification. And so the difference is, for example, this character can't know that he's really in the licorice lagoon. He's just a piece of plastic or whatever. This world is an illusion. But if he's having experiences, let's just pretend that this character is having full-on experiences like we are. And in his mind, he's in a more robust world. He doesn't see the board. He sees the licorice lagoon itself with all of its detail, as if the same way you see the world when you walk around it, in it. So the idea is he can't know that he's there. It's false. But Pryor wants to ultimately argue, and the question that he's putting to the skeptic is, isn't he justified in believing that he's in the licorice lagoon? I mean, he looks around, and everywhere he looks, there's licorice plants, and there's the black water, or whatever else is in there. So everything he sees is telling him that he's in the licorice lagoon. So it seems like even though he doesn't know because it's false, he's just on this piece of cardboard, it seems like we should be able to say something about him being justified. He's got justification for thinking he's there. But where does the justification come from? The idea is, it comes from his experiences. It's because he's having this perceptual experiences as of being in the licorice lagoon that we want to say he's justified in thinking he's really there. So real quick, this also gives us an opportunity to say something else about what the perceptual dogmatist is ultimately going to say. The perceptual dogmatist says that the character has some justification just on the basis of his experience, even though he can't rule out the possibility that he's being deceived by an evil demon, like this evil demon-looking guy here. So there might be justification flowing in, even though he's deceived. Now, for us, who are living in the real world, the idea is, remember, we're not saying that the universe doesn't really exist, the external world doesn't really exist. If it really exists, and we get the same kind of perceptual justification as this guy does, just by virtue of having our experiences, then we get justification and truth. Since, I really am not on a cardboard square, but I'm actually in my apartment right now. And so that level of justification that the character we're imagining has, I have that justification too. And so I have a justified true belief. And so one of the things we're doing here is we're setting aside the Gettier stuff. Don't worry about the Gettier stuff right now. It'll be enough for Pryor's ambitions if we can get true justified belief, even in the face of this, having a skeptic to deal with. Okay, so as I said in the beginning, Pryor thinks that the skeptic's original argument, the old-fashioned argument, is not as good as it could be, and he wants to make it better. And the problem that he sees with it is that the argument, as traditionally stated, is not about justification, but it's about knowledge. So I have this in the slides, and you should go through carefully and look at these. But the traditional argument, as he states it, is the first premise is that you're not in a position to know that you're not being deceived by an evil demon right now. Premise 2, if you're to know anything about the external world on the basis of your current perceptual experiences, then you have to be in a position to know that you're not being deceived by an evil demon right now. So it follows from 1 and 2 that you don't know anything about the external world on the basis of your current perceptual experiences, including the proposition that you've got hands, that sort of stuff. So, okay, so he gives this criticism. Pryor gives a criticism of this argument. Specifically, he criticizes the first premise, that you're not in a position to know you're not being deceived by an evil demon right now. Why does he think... Oh, so he says the criticism is that this is question-begging. So why is it question-begging? So the idea is, well, if Moore is right, and I can know that I have hands, and it follows from the fact that I have hands that I'm not a handless, deceived being, then I can know. So in that way, what Pryor is saying is that just making this a premise that you're not in a position to know that you're not being deceived by an evil demon begs the question against Moore. This happens a lot of times in philosophy. If you have one side that says you're question begging, the other side can often say, well, no, you're question begging. That just happens a lot. So sometimes it becomes a kind of stalemate in that way. So basically, if Pryor is right, then the skeptic needs a better argument, better than this one, so that he doesn't use a question-begging premise. That's premise 1. And premise 2 is, if you're not in a position to know that you're not being deceived by an evil demon, then you can't trust your... Well, you can't trust your senses, but more specifically, you're not in a position to know that you're not being deceived. So if you're able to know anything about the external world on the basis of your perceptual experience, then you have to be in a position to know that you're not being deceived by an evil demon right now. So that's all stated in terms of knowledge. Okay, I'm going to bring in another prop here. I got a $20 bill, and I'm going to try to use this with some effects. So there's basically, one way of putting this is there are two kinds of perceptions. There are the kinds that are backed up by knowledge that you are not being deceived by an evil demon. And let's represent that by having a certain color scheme. So this is what, I'm just going to use this image to represent how I perceive the world when I also have a guarantee that I'm not in a bad, what he calls a bad scenario or a skeptical scenario. When I can rule out with 100% certainty the possibility that I'm being deceived somehow or other by dreams or by a demon. Then I see it this way. And then there are these other circumstances that I can be in when I don't see with that kind, like, in other words, my perception is not backed up by a guarantee that I'm not in a bad scenario. This is just a supplementary cutaway commenting on my original recording. But the thing I want is I want a color that just represents basically ordinary perception if you think that ordinarily we don't have that kind of guarantee. So it's really this other color that I'm introducing is basically just the same as having a regular screen. It's just a reminder that there's no guarantee backing up that ordinary perception. There's no guarantee that we're not in a demon scenario or not dreaming. It's whatever perceptual experiences we have normally, but in the scenario where we don't have the ability to rule out the skeptic's bad scenarios. And then in that case, they'll represent it as this. And so then the question that Pryor is trying to raise is this kind of perception where I don't have a guarantee, where I haven't ruled out the skeptical possibility, sufficient for being justified? And the skeptic that he wants to characterize says that only this kind of experience is a source of justification. And remember, I have this kind of experience when I have a guarantee that I'm not being deceived by a demon or not dreaming. Okay, returning to this scenario, we can say what this looks like. This is the scenario where he does not have knowledge that he's not being deceived. But we can't switch to this color because, as I defined it before, I said this means that you know that you're not being deceived. You ruled out the scenario. But we can't get to that. I mean, that doesn't make sense here because it's not true. So this is part of the reason why we need to redefine the terms of the skeptical argument. Because what we really need is a scenario like where the person has justification. Now, here I mean justification for the things he sees around him, that he's in Licorice Lagoon, not justification that he's not being deceived by a demon. So there's a different kind of position that we might think about where you have, let's use a third color like this. This is the scenario where this character is justified in believing that he's not being deceived. So now remember here the distinction between knowledge and truth, between truth and justification. It's okay that we can stipulate, for example, that right now I truly am not being deceived. The question is whether or not I can be justified in believing that. And in the scenario that I'm considering, I am justified in believing that. That's what the color represents. I'm justified in believing that I'm not deceived. And I can share that justification with the plastic guy. So he might be justified in believing that he's not deceived just like I am. But my belief is true. His belief is false. That's what I'm trying to make that distinction here. Complicated. Okay. But where does the justification that you're not being deceived come from? I mean, this is the kind of skeptical worry that many people are aware of or sensitive to. How can he have any source of justification that he's not being deceived by a demon? It seems like all of his justification that he could have comes from his senses or his perceptual experiences. So if he can't somehow rule that out, then he's in trouble. He can't trust his senses, it seems. He doesn't have any source of justification other than his senses themselves. And if we can't trust those, then you're kind of screwed. Okay, so the way that he puts the skeptical argument in the reformulated way, based on perceptual justification, is premise one is, if you're justified in believing that you're not being deceived by an evil demon, then that justification has to flow from your perceptual experiences. That's premise one. If there's any source of justification that I'm not deceived by an evil demon, it has to come by way of my perception. I shouldn't even say knowledge, I should just say my perceptual justification of the way that the world is tells me that I'm here and not a sort of handless, bodiless mind being deceived. But here's the second premise. If you're ever to be justified in believing anything about the external world on the basis of your sense perceptions, then you have to have you have to be in a position to antecedently justify rejecting the skeptical hypothesis. So you have to be in a position to say, I'm not being deceived. I'm justified in thinking I'm not being deceived by a demon in order to trust your senses. So in the old version, I needed to be this, and in the new version, I need to be this. If you remember, go rewind and check the difference just in case you don't follow yet. So this is the new form of the skeptical argument. And it's still powerful. I mean, it's not like it's a weaker version of the argument. It's the idea is trying to articulate more precisely what's going wrong. So what's going wrong, as in why we don't have access to, we don't have justified beliefs. We don't have any justified perceptual beliefs. The skeptic says, in order to be justified in our sense perception, you have to have been able to somehow or other justify the belief that you're not being deceived. So again, you just have this guy here, and he's he's thinking to himself, well, I must be justified in believing that I'm in the lagoon, in the licorice lagoon, because I have this perceptual experience of being in the lagoon. And then the skeptic comes along and says, well, you can't really be justified in believing that you're in the lagoon because you don't have any justification for ruling out the skeptical hypothesis that you're being deceived. And he says, well, I actually, the way that Pryor and Moore want to say, or well, at least Pryor wants to say, is that the guy has justification for believing that he's in the licorice lagoon, even though he doesn't have justification for believing that he's not deceived. Okay, so now to see why this is an advantage, think back to Moore. Moore is saying, I know that I have a hand, I know that I have a hand here, and this new skeptical argument is saying, wait, let's just talk about justification instead. You say you're justified in believing that you have a hand, and the Moore type says, yeah, I think I'm justified in believing that I have a hand. And they say, well, don't you think that in order to be justified in believing that, you have to be antecedently justified beforehand in ruling out the possibility that you're deceived, ruling out the possibility that there's a deceiver, that you're dreaming. You need to have some explanation that lets you trust that your perceptions are a source of justification. If you don't have any justification for believing that, then you don't have any right to trust your perceptions of your hands. And then the second premise is, you can't have any... Oh, my laundry's ready. You can't have any justification for believing that there's no evil demon other than your perceptions themselves. And so if your perceptions aren't trustworthy because you can't rule out the possibility of there being an evil demon, then you also have no justification for trusting them themselves. So G.E. Moore is like, I see a hand here, but the skeptic is saying, you have no reason to trust your perception as justification for that belief unless you can somehow prove to me that you're justified in thinking that there's no demon. That's what I was just recapping here. So then the conclusion of the upgraded skeptical argument is that you can't be justified in believing that you're not deceived by an evil demon. You can't be justified in that belief. So if that's right, then Moore's argument fails, because Moore was trying to say, well, here's a hand, here's another hand. I've given you proof that there's an external world, therefore I know that there's an external world. And this version of the skeptical argument is saying, well, I've shown that you can't be justified in believing that there's an external world if you can't rule out the possibility of the evil demon. So the crucial supporting principle is what Pryor calls the skeptic's principle of justification, or the skeptical principle of justification. I forget what it's called. Let me see if I can state it without looking. Okay, here's the skeptical principle of justification. If you're to have justification for believing P on the basis of a certain experience, or grounds E, E is for evidence, then for every Q, every scenario which is bad relative to E and P, in other words, these are the skeptical scenarios. The bad ones are the ones that undercut your evidence for P. So now the statement is, you only have antecedent justification you have to have antecedent justification for believing that Q is false in order to have the justification for P on the grounds of the E. And it has to be non-question. This is the sort of sense in which it's question-begging, this idea, is that the justification has to rest on something other than the E-based justification that you have for believing P. So let me just try to unpack this for a minute. So the idea is then, say that P is, I have hands. The grounds is my experience, my perceptual experience of looking at it, or there's a $20 bill on the ground there. My perceptual experience is the source of my knowledge of that. Supposedly, that's the grounds, my experience of the thing. But in order for that, this is a conditional, in order for that to count as a source of justification, it has to be the case that for every scenario that's bad relative to E and P, namely like I've been dreaming for my whole life, or there's an evil demon deceiving me, I have to have an antecedent justification for believing that that's false. I have to have a justification for believing that there is no demon, or that I'm not dreaming, And that justification for Q, for believing that Q is false, can't rest on or presuppose my evidence for believing that I have hands. So this is the statement that's trying to get undermine Moore's argument. It says, I don't have any justification coming from my experience that I have hands if I'm still sort of stuck with the inability to rule out that there is an evil demon. I have no justification for believing that I'm not being deceived. Any justification that I could have, like I see the world around me, this is my tripod, by the way, for my camera. Any justification that I have for thinking that this is here, well, roughly, I just don't have any such justification unless I have some other non-experience-based reason for thinking that there's no evil demon. So this is a principle that Descartes would accept, I think. And his point, the way that Descartes does it is he thinks he proves to himself from within the method of doubt that there's a God, and that a God wouldn't let you be deceived in the way that he's imagining we might be deceived. So that would be the kind of argument that goes along with what I called last time, what Pryor calls the ambitious skeptical project. That means convincing the skeptic on their own terms that you have knowledge. But what Pryor is interested in doing is not that. He's not trying to convince the skeptic that this is false. He thinks that, well, the skeptic is just is accepting this thing, but Pryor is not going to accept this principle. And what that means is he needs to defend a view on which this conditional is false. In other words, in which you can have justification for believing P on the basis of grounds of experience E, but where it's not the case that you have to have an antecedent justification for ruling out the possibility that you're being deceived. So that's more or less what perceptual dogmatism is going to be about. It's going to be about stating a theory on which the skeptical principle of justification is false. So on the view that Pryor likes, I can know that there is a $20 bill here, even though I'm in this condition. My perceptions of it are not backed up by a guarantee or by justification that that the bad scenario is false, that I'm not justified in believing there's no evil demon. Or if I am justified in believing that there's no evil demon, it's on the basis of my experience a la Moore. It's all like, I see I have a hand, I'm therefore justified in believing that I have a hand and that I'm not a brain in a vat or a deceived mind that has no body. I only have this kind of justification. I don't have this kind. So if I do have justification that there's a 20 here, then that SJK principle has to be false because I have no antecedent justification for thinking I'm not deceived. And just to return to the Candyland position one more time, this character has no knowledge. That's because it's not true. His beliefs aren't even true. But the skeptic says he's also not justified in believing where he's at. So he's got experiences as of he's experiencing moving through the licorice lagoon. But the intuition, if you've got it, that he's justified in believing he's in the licorice lagoon is false on the skeptic's point of view. He's not even justified in believing that because he has no sort of separate justification for ruling out the skeptic's argument. So the skeptical scenario that he's really just a plastic figure on a cardboard surface. Now, I want to just reiterate one last time here that this is not what we're taking the scenario we're in to be. So we're not supposing that we're actually in a skeptical world. The point is just that we can't rule out that we're not in a skeptical world. So this is, again, one more time, this kind of consideration about truth versus knowledge. We're really concerned more with knowledge. We're not worrying that the actual world is not there. Well, I shouldn't put it that way. We are worried in a certain sense. We're worried that we can't know for certain. We can't have any justification to believe that there's an external world out there. Okay, this has been a statement of what is also called the new evil demon problem, which is this idea that in the bad scenario where the belief is actually false, there's still some sense in which the person should should count as justified. I mean, they have all these great experiences that are showing them a world in front of them. There's some sense in which they're doing something right. They're rational in believing the thing that's in front of their eyes.